City on a Hill, Volume 2, Light of the World. Genesis 18, King James Version. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me. And if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence, and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near, and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy, and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spake unto him again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. And he said unto him, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Peradventure there shall 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30. And he said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way, as soon as he had left communing with Abraham. And Abraham returned unto his place. Chapter 10. Cell. Sabrina wished that Lindsey had shot her. Her life over, she would not have had to endure this humiliation, this betrayal. The other occultists stripped her of her weapons, her grapple, her visor, and after fumbling with it, the power pack on her belt that drove her patrol suit. Blindfolded, gagged, hands bound, she was led roughly down a hallway, the hands of strangers, occultists, under her armpits. Her captors interpreted her weaving arrhythmic steps as resistance and shoved her harder. They were wrong. The pain from her knee, from Lindsey's deception. Sabrina could not walk a straight line. Lindsey's feeble protests, the sound of her voice, Don't hurt her! She is my friend! Simply made the weakness taking over her body worse. Was she one of them all this time? Intermittently, Sabrina's training resurfaced. She tried to pick out voices, determine a sense of direction, but each time she found her sharpness elusive, pushed out of reach by her emotions, the tide of Lindsey's betrayal. She heard a heavy door open. Someone called it a meat locker. They pushed her inside. The echoes felt close. She paced the sides. Before she made a full circuit, she vomited. She retched until there was nothing left in her stomach, staggered across the room, slid down the wall to the floor. The back of her throat burned like an ember was lodged there. Her knees were hot and wet with the contents of her stomach. The locker was too small to escape from the foul odor. Nausea returned, irresistible. She vomited again. Eventually she heard people outside, and the door opened. Lindsey's voice, cracking as she took in the sight of Sabrina, slumped, covered in her own vomit. Sabrina, I'm so sorry. Lindsey was immediately beside her, a warm hand on her cheek, in her hair. The blindfold was removed, and Lindsey's face was before her, tears dropping from her lashes. I'm so sorry. I did not want you to find out this way. She was wearing one of her ridiculous patchwork dresses that mixed floral patterns with skulls and crossbones. It stopped just at the knee, like a schoolgirl's. Over it was a cardigan she had also made, but with one sleeve red, the other blue, and the rest green. The entire image blurred. Lindsey tried to wipe Sabrina's tears with the blindfold. "Don't touch me!" Lindsey hesitated, then in a quick, forceful gesture wiped the vomit from Sabrina's nose, mouth, and chin, before tossing the blindfold to the floor. The light changed as a figure moved in the doorway. Sabrina was vaguely aware that he held a rifle across his chest, but her eyes remained fixed on the stained knees of her trousers. An acidic, mashed-up mess of her lunch of olives and flatbread clung to the fabric. "Please don't cry, Sabrina. You never cry. You're the strong one." "No, I'm not. Not anymore." "Stop," Lindsey said, her voice firm. "Sabrina, you've been my strength when there was nothing else for me to turn to." "For this? Why didn't you tell me?" On some unreasonable level, Sabrina was jealous. Jealous that as Lindsey's best friend, she was never let in on her secret life. That she was somehow not close enough to be told, to be trusted. Now all these people had a piece of Lindsey that she did not. What did that leave her with? She felt sick again. "Sabrina," Lindsey said, her voice free of tears now. "Remember watching the sunset over the water in the summers? How we would climb up on the roof and the tiles would be so hot that they would burn our bottoms through our clothes?" She paused, as if waiting for Sabrina to acknowledge the memory, but Sabrina would not give her the pleasure. She continued anyway. "Remember the smell of jasmine, and watching the first stars appearing in the west, and the sense that there was something behind the beauty that we could not capture in words. Something transcendent, universal, eternal even." "I remember," Sabrina said, "but it's not intangible. You can capture it in your paintings." "Merely shadows, Sabrina." "Not to me." Sabrina dropped her head. "Please don't cry." "Don't cry? But you left me." No. How could I tell you? I wanted to. All we share, but with Dag and your training. I couldn't burden you." "So you betrayed me instead?" Lindsey was silent. The metal wall was cold and pressing against Sabrina's back. "How did you end up with them?" "It was something in me. The sunsets were just the start. But even you can understand. Your sense of justice, it's innate in you, since the day you were born. But where does it come from? Beauty, justice, love, they all flow from the same source. We're all attracted to that source at some point." It did not sound so terrible coming from Lindsey, and for a moment, Sabrina could see the reason in such beliefs. But then, ruined eyes of the victims of the cataclysm appeared in her mind. The whites burned out by a weapon with the power of a sun. A golden sun with 6 points on a wall in an abandoned house. A sword. A moon shaped like a blade. These were weapons of death, not love. "Then I found a flyer," Lindsey said. "It was all disintegrated and faded, but it literally blew up to my feet one day, as if it was meant to be there. I remember the words perfectly. Is something missing from your life? Something more, but you can't say what? Do you believe? Join the underground." It appealed to me. There is so much missing in my life. The beauty I can never quite capture in a painting, an explanation for my premonitions. Something told me I had to look. So I went out at night. Don't ask me how I knew they would meet at night. I just did. Maybe that was some sort of premonition. I'd sneak out, wandering into the blocks, Sterner Street, Hills 34 and 33. Sabrina could not help a protective shudder. Lindsey had wandered into places where she would not enter without a charged blaster on her hip. She was lucky not to have been caught as a scrit on the hills. And yet there was Lindsey, skipping along, the bells in her hair jingling. "I know," Lindsey said, reading the shock on her face. "It was crazy. I don't know how I didn't get killed. But I channeled you. Sometimes I'd talk to you, pretend you were with me. I'd walk like I'd seen you walk. When I had a close call one night and actually got chased by some men, I asked myself, what would Sabrina do?" She knelt closer. Her hands slipped down Sabrina's forearm, over her bindings, and closed around her fingers. "You were with me the entire time. You just didn't know." Their foreheads touched. "I'm so sorry, Sabrina." For an instant, they were Sabrina and Lindsey again. But Sabrina knew this feeling of wholeness was not lasting. There was a crash outside, and the floor under them shook. The door groaned as it wobbled on its rusted hinges. The guard looked left, then right, his eyes wide. Gunshots sounded from down the hall. "We're under attack!" he cried. A faint whine pierced the air and slowly metastasized. The cries of children. Thousands of children. "No, no, no!" Lindsey said, jumping to her feet as she recognized the eerie sound of the Elved's turbines. "What have you done, Sabrina?" "They were going to find you eventually." "Whore!" the guard said, lowering his rifle at Sabrina's face and lining his eye up over the barrel. The gun's retort cut short Lindsey's scream as she threw herself at the weapon. Sparks danced off the metal wall. The shot rang so loudly in Sabrina's ears that she could not even hear the sounds of the scuffle as Lindsey held fast to the gun to prevent the guard from firing again. He was doing his best to try to wrench it away from her, prying her fingers the way a parent would pry a child's. With his other hand, he was trying to eject the cartridge. That was when Sabrina realized just what an old weapon it was. It was no more dangerous than a club until he rocked back the lever, removed the spent cartridge, and chambered a new round. An archaic bullet. This meant an opportunity to attack. Her hands were still bound, but she slid herself up the wall, stepped, pivoted, and kicked the back of the guard's knee. He dropped hard onto the floor, striking his head against the wall, but as he fell, his hands snapped the lever back, and the old cartridge tinkled onto the floor. He had a clear shot at Sabrina until Lindsey stepped directly in front of the weapon, touching it gently now and moving it to her heart. "Marcus," she said, "the first bullet will have to be for me." The floor shook again, and the lights of the hall flickered. Marcus straightened his finger out, away from the trigger. "How could you betray us?" he asked. "I'm not betraying you. I just don't want you to kill my friend. There's a difference." The hallway was noisy with running feet. Occultists sprinted back and forth, some fleeing the danger, others seeking it out. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. "I'll stay with Sabrina." He moved the gun to the side, placing the butt on the floor while he leaned on the wall to get up. His chest was heaving as he looked back and forth between Sabrina and Lindsey. He seemed to come to some decision before shaking his head and handing the weapon over to Lindsey. "You'll need this." He went to the door and limped away to the left. The building shook again. Lindsey grabbed Sabrina and pulled her into the corridor. Sabrina followed Lindsey, her locks, braids, bows, and bells bouncing on her back as she ran the length of the corridor and down a flight of steps, holding the gun by the stock. Sabrina could tell that Lindsey knew this building well. They came to the main hall. People were pressing to the exits in a panic. The floor was a mess of overturned benches, twisted beach towels, and trampled pillows. Glass was falling out of windows, and dust was coming off rafters in sheets. A few occultists clustered in tight knots on their knees, their heads bowed while they prayed. Light flashed from the windows as though an electrical storm was overhead. Through a newly opened hole in a crumbling wall, the oblong head of an Elved was briefly visible while it stalked through the adjacent section of the building, the hissing of its hydraulics and clumping of its feet terrifyingly close. A second flash lit the old factory like a bolt of lightning as the machine stunned fleeing occultists. A door in the same wall burst open. Unarmed occultists came running through in full retreat, tripping over one another, their faces pale and sweat-streaked. A second surge of armed occultists seeking to attack the machine collided with them. Women screamed. Children cried. Another flash. Bodies fell to the ground. No one seemed to notice Sabrina. The armed occultists took up positions behind anything they could, benches, boxes, and tumbled walls, while women and children retreated to a corner. With the sound of wrenching steel, the roof peeled back, and the jet roar of a second Elved surged down upon them in a wave of heat and stifling exhaust. Sabrina and Lindsey doubled over, coughing. On two blazing blue spears of fire, the Elved lowered itself into their midst. Gunfire erupted all around them. Lindsey raised her rifle. "Lindsey, no!" Sabrina cried and rammed her friend so that they both fell to the ground. "Don't fight it!" "It will kill us all!" Sabrina thought back to what Sean had said and hoped it was true. "Not if you're with me. It will know me in my patrol suit." Her mind raced with possibilities. If they escaped, could they start over? She would look the other way this once. She'd do anything, just to get them both out alive. "Get me out of these cuffs!" Lindsey scrambled over fallen bricks to reach Sabrina's bound wrists. Meanwhile, the Elved touched down, its talons flexing on the cracking floor. Projectiles banged noisily off its black carapace, marked with a white number 7. A flash crackled from its fingertips, coalesced into an arc, danced among the occultists against the south wall, then traveled up a fallen rafter and dissipated. The fully struck occultist dropped to the floor. One man, partially shocked, tried to drag himself away on his arms, his legs stiff and paralyzed. They still had time, Sabrina thought. The Elved was incapacitating, but not killing. The machine turned to the east wall where half a dozen occultists were taking cover behind a boiler. Another bolt, and they dropped to the floor like puppets with their strings cut. Lindsey broke through Sabrina's cuffs with a craft knife she pulled from her pocket. "Come on, we need to move," Sabrina said, scrambling to her feet. Lindsey led her behind a chunk of fallen roof as a third bolt felled a cluster of occultists running for the doorway. Sabrina brushed the residue of the crumbling ceiling off her suit. "It will have to know I'm here. It has to recognize me as a cadet." Lindsey winced as she watched other occultists fall. A new wave of men rushed the room and began firing their ancient weapons while Sabrina searched for an exit. Stray shots struck the wall just over her head. Sabrina shouted, wishing she had not lost her blaster. A tall man broke from the crowd carrying a long rifle and charged the Elved. His eyes were wide with fury, his hair rising from his head like dark flames, his teeth bared. "Into your weapons I send my ghost!" Angelo cried. Sabrina had not thought of him since the shock of discovering Lindsey. But he reemerged from the nameless occultists, a terrible reminder of the duty that had brought her there in the first place. His long legs carried him over the inert bodies of his comrades. The Elved was momentarily turned to the corner, allowing Angelo to get within an arm's reach. He thrust the mouth of the weapon into the hydraulic stems and ribbed hoses that connected the machine's head to its thorax and fired. The arc of white light ceased, and the right arm of the Elved splintered apart and reformed. A single serrated blade replaced the claw that had been there moments before. In one motion, it split Anselm's rifle in half. In a second swipe, it sent his head flying from his shoulders. "No," Sabrina said, the breath sucked out of her. Before Anselm's body dropped to the floor, the Elved's arms splintered again as armaments and panels rearranged themselves into a ring of spinning barrels. This was a projectile weapon as well, but it fired in such quick succession that its bangs were a sustained roar, like a buzzsaw. Lindsey screamed as the projectiles struck the occultists and their bodies were dismembered. Bits of clothing and flesh whipped into the air. Walls collapsed as bricks disintegrated into dust. It was chaos. Those occultists who could dropped their weapons and fled through one of the doorways to another section of the warehouse, but the first Elved waited for them on the other side. The retreat reversed in Sabrina and Lindsey's direction and was soon overtaking them. Blood and burnt clothing landed all around as the Elveds found their marks. "Fools," Sabrina thought. All of them fools for believing in the first place. Now for resisting the nightmarish machines. A fresh wave of occultists appeared in the very doorway Sabrina had hoped to escape through. They collided with the retreating mob, and the momentum of both crowds choked. More occultists cried out, "Into your weapons I send my ghost," before throwing themselves into the fire of the machine. Sabrina grabbed Lindsey and pushed her behind a fallen rafter. Blood, hot as water from a bath, fell on them as the occultists were cut down. Lindsey's face was greenish, and her eyes had taken on a stare of deep shock. Blood stained her clothes, hair, and skin. Her lips were moving, but Sabrina could tell she was sliding into incoherence. The hiss of hydraulics and the crunch of debris moved closer. A few more bold yells were cut short, replaced by the purring of the machine's servos and motors on the other side of the rafter. The rafter screeched as it was twisted upwards and thrust away, and the implacable oblong face of the Elved appeared, gazing at them through a cloud of dust. Blood ran down its obsidian surface as it bent closer to examine them. Lindsey screamed, crawling backwards before flipping over onto her hands and knees to scramble for cover. Sabrina threw herself on top of her, doing her best to expose herself and the suit. She did not know if the Elved could see through the blood and dust, but the green light lasered the clouds about them as the machine stepped closer. Sabrina wrestled to keep Lindsey beneath her. "I am Cadet Sabria!" she cried out over and over. "Sabrina Sabria!" A metal talon clutched around her torso, crushing the air out of her and lifting her off the floor. Lindsey immediately began to run, but the other appendage formed itself into a talon and closed around her. Her face turned red as she pushed and kicked at the machine. One of her shoes flew off as she continued to kick. "Sabrina, help me!" "She's in my custody! She's in my custody!" The Elved moved Lindsey closer to its face, green light dancing over the length of her body. "She has surrendered!" A bolt of pain ran through Sabrina from wherever the talons touched her. All she could do was scream. Chapter 11. Acre. Sabrina had long ago exceeded her allotment of hot water, but she still sat in the cold shower, staring at the drain. The blood, the dust, the ash were all gone. She was left with nothing. She barely felt the cold, although she could see her limbs beginning to shake, her skin taut with goosebumps. She realized the clicking noise she heard was the sound of her teeth chattering. She wrapped her arms about her knees and pulled them closer to her chest and wept, her arms and thighs absorbing the sound of her sobbing. Leaving this stream was unimaginable. Here she could close her eyes and lose herself to the tumbling, tapping waterfall on her head. Under that icy drumming, there was no past, no future, just now. "Sabrina!" Sean was pounding on the door. He had been checking on her every few minutes. How long had he been pounding this time? "Sabrina, say something or I'm coming in." "Go away." The door handle shook, then splintered apart as he kicked in the door. The curtain peeled back. "Isa, Sabrina." Her body was shaking as he pulled her up. She caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned so pale that her veins stood out starkly. Her lips were drained of any pink. "I'm blue," she mumbled, shock taking over. Sean's sleeve was wet and cold where he had reached in to pull her out. A female counseling officer appeared in the doorway. Sabrina could not take another stranger in her home. "Get out! Get out!" she screamed. "Get her out!" She struck at Sean, punching him, kicking him as best as the small space would allow, until he wrapped her in a large towel and then his arms, squeezing her until she could not breathe. There seemed a precise moment when under the pressure of his embrace her sorrow had nowhere to go, and something inside her broke. She wept so violently and suddenly that she did not care if the other cadets and officers stationed outside her door heard. She woke in her bed, wrapped tightly in blankets. The first thing she saw was the frame that held the picture of her with Lindsey's family at the beach. The photo was in the frame Lindsey had made for her. It exploded with color, its smooth sides broken by the ceramic caterpillars she had fashioned at the edges, each segment of their bodies a different color. The happy figures in the picture seemed to mock her. "When did it begin, Lindsey? Were you betraying us even then? When could I have helped?" She remembered that day vividly. It was not their first trip to the shore, but it was the first time they had ventured out into the surf on wave boards. Timing her strokes to catch the momentum of a wave, riding its force, just teetering on the edge of chaos, did not captivate Lindsey the way it had Sabrina. Lindsey preferred swimming out beyond the breakers, where they could float on their boards for untold stretches of time, staring after the shafts of sunlight that continued into the sea's depths. During one of these interludes, Sabrina had spied an unusual fish moving slowly below the surface. It was not until she pinched it between her fingers that she realized it was not a fish at all, but a paisley ribbon gone loose from Lindsey's braids. "You can do much more interesting things with your hair than I can," Sabrina had said. "This rat's nest?" Lindsey replied, reaching up to her head. "At least you add color and stuff to yours." Sabrina slapped the water with the stray ribbon. "Mine is just black." "But it's beautifully black." Lindsey turned and rebalanced on her board. "Black like the sky between the stars. Black like the ocean depths." "No one writes poems about the sky between the stars." Lindsey's hands and feet slapped at the water as she moved closer. "But those things keep the sparkly, effervescent, and capricious parts in place." Sabrina put down the picture before her tears blurred her vision. She remembered the day they had exchanged the frames, how she had felt a hollow open in her chest, seeing the intricate artwork on Lindsey's. The suctioned feet of the caterpillars, the markings on their backs, the expressions on their faces. Her own was no more than a sleek silver-black frame that she had bought from a shop on Searle Street. Yet Lindsey had hugged Sabrina's gift to her breast. When Sabrina had protested, insisting that she would buy a more elaborate one, Lindsey had refused. "No! It's elegant! Streamlined, tough!" She ran her fingers over the steel of its frame. "It's you." Sabrina rolled on her back and stared up at the ceiling. To her surprise, they had been gentle with her at the station, keeping the questioning session brief. But what reason did they have to doubt her? She had just brought in her best friend. Her commitment was unquestionable now. Not only that, she had raided a network of occultists on her own. Well, not on her own. With the help of 2 Elveds. She had not been conscious, but the machine had lifted her out of the ruined building and deposited her at the barricades that the T-men had set up around the old factory, after Sean had called for additional support. Since both machines had switched into a more lethal attack mode, it was lucky that she and Lindsey had been spared. The officers and T-men both were at a loss to explain it. Her fingers traced the places on her body where the damnable thing had shocked her. Her skin was still tender, and her hands recoiled when she touched a particularly sore region. She slipped out of bed and crossed to her closet. Her communicator was off, but she did not bother to activate it. The noise of her footsteps roused Sean, who was sleeping propped in the doorway, still in his patrol suit. One of her blankets was across his legs. His hair was sticking up from a night leaning against the wall. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and he needed to shave. The female counseling officer had helped her to put on her pajamas the night before. She was by no means indecent, but Sean averted his eyes anyway. "Hey," was all she could manage. "Hey," he said, rubbing his neck and wincing. "I'm glad you slept." "It had been a while," she said, pulling a dress uniform from a hanger. She noticed her patrol suit missing. She wondered if they would ever give her one again. As if reading her thoughts, Sean said, "They're not going to enact any disciplinary action against you. You brought your friend in. You led us all there. 190 occultists captured. People are talking about a commendation. No cadet has ever..." "How many killed?" I don't... Sean. 56. At least that is the estimate." She pulled the uniform off the hanger and stepped into the bathroom to change. It was no use trying to close the door. The frame had been shattered when he kicked it in. What do you think? She said, pulling on her trousers. Of a commendation. As your supervisor? As my friend. I wouldn't want to be you. He seemed to regret his words immediately. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... I know what you mean, she said, speaking to her own reflection, a face she did not seem to recognize. She's my best friend, Sean. Like a sister. If I had known, I wouldn't have... He silenced her with a shush. I know, but don't say it. Not to me. Strands of her hair stuck to the bottom of the sink. She pulled elastic from the nearest cabinet and wrestled her hair into a ponytail. When she emerged from the bathroom, she was the picture of a polished professional officer. Sean straightened up and tried, without success, to flatten the hair on the side of his head. Help yourself to any food in the cold box, she said, picking up her comm cube and clicking it on. Where are you going? The moment she activated it, the cube buzzed in her palm. There was only one message, but she knew exactly what it would say even before she read it. She could nearly hear the edge in Dag's voice as she read his words in the message field. See me, immediately. As she had anticipated, the guards and the counselor outside her apartment door had received strict, if inexplicable, orders that Cadet Sabria was to be allowed to move freely and unaccompanied as soon as she emerged from her apartment. Only Sean, who had been focused so intently on her, had not known. She did not offer him any explanation. Instead, she only waited to ensure he would not follow her before she climbed into her CRP and started south for the head ministry. It seemed as if her uncle's will had been enforced upon the breadth of the city. Traffic flowed in her favor. Crosswalks remained empty. When she reached the head ministry, the front gate was opened, and the guards remained in their control booths. She did not encounter a single soul as she marched through the halls. The heavy security door that led to the most forbidden space in the entire land between the walls, the old city, opened automatically for her. She stepped through into a different time. The alleyways were narrow and snaking, the buildings alongside them a chaotic mix of shapes, sizes, and materials. Some were built purely of flat stones packed one atop the other. These were mostly collapse, their interiors filling with drifts of sand. Other houses of hardier construction remained steadfast, the heavier mason-cut stones smoothed to the touch, and still standing in even rows. In some places the walls were plain and utilitarian. In others, they were carved with alcoves for lamps or shops, or simply for benches. The alleyways were a maze, with no plan or reason to them. Nothing like the straight, eminently rational designs of Fortinbras and Lysander. Sabrina had always loved them for this very reason. It had taken her years as a child to learn them all, but learn them she did, losing herself for hours, sometimes days at a time. She had never grown scared, because she knew if lost, she could walk until she reached the ocean that bordered the old city on 3 sides, the head ministry building the 4th. It was when she had been lost that she had stumbled upon her most incredible finds. Domed towers, soaring steeples, a courtyard of colonnades, gardens grown wild into a veritable forest within sandy, heat-cracked walls. Now, like old friends, the passageways offered her small details to help her find her way. A leaning column, a tree that had long ago broken out of its pot to spread its roots over the stone path, a rusting gate, a dry fountain, a stopped clock. In places, she had to climb over the wreckage of wooden balconies whose rotted joists had sent them crashing into the walkway. In another, she found her way blocked by a collapsed wall, noting the damage that time was taking with some sadness. How long before this magical place would be gone? But the ruined wall opened the way to the shore, allowing sunlight to flood into a passageway that had been locked in shadow for unknown centuries. Grasshoppers chirped and snapped into the air as she waded through the grass that had grown up between the collapsed bricks. Along the shore she stopped and listened to the gentle slurp of water snapping at the bases of the remaining buildings. Across the water, Between her and the eastern shore of the bay, the ruins of an unnamed tower rode the waves, aprons of surf sloughing off its rocky base and swirling the long strands of algae clinging to its rocks. How long would he wait? She walked a few more steps along the shore before turning to follow the sequence of passages that led her to the tunnel that traversed the width of the peninsula. How she had feared it as a child, the long, dark, unlit blackness. Now, in its tomb-like darkness, she felt safe for the first time, completely invisible to the prying, judgmental eyes that awaited her outside. If only my life could end right here, right now, in this darkness. The wooden walkway beneath her feet creaked with each step as she progressed through the tunnel. As a child, this passage through the cold darkness beneath the city had always seemed to last an eternity. Now it was over too quickly, for she knew her uncle waited on the other side. Dim light appeared, and the yellowing stones of the curving roof became visible again. A breeze pushed the smell of dust and mortar from her nose, and replaced it with the scent of the salt sea. Her eyes stung as she stepped back into the light. The sea opened up before her, the hills above Fortinbras, dim green outlines on the northern horizon. Dag was standing in the sea. The city had collapsed here where the waves had undermined the foundations of an old fort, leaving a crater in the peninsula. Green water lapped up onto the shelf, creating a large wading pool where the abrupt drop-off into deeper waters was marked by piles of ruins that had once been the seaward buttresses of the fortress. Dag was barefoot, his trousers rolled to his knees, his ministry jacket replaced by a white shirt, its tails untucked and curling in the breeze. He would have been the picture of a relaxed beach walker if it were not for his stillness and his hands clasped behind his back so tightly that his knuckles were white. So much for looking like a polished professional, she thought, removing her boots. She could not bring herself to roll her trousers. From the ankles up, she would cling to the appearance of an officer. It may be the last time I can. He was standing beside a pile of rubble, staring into the deeper water. He did not move when she stepped up next to him. His eyes were red, and the skin beneath them dark. She doubted he had slept all night. Sunlight, reflected from the badge on her breast, danced on the surface of the restless water. Here, some of the ancient invaders created a fortress, he said, his voice weak and soft. He spoke slowly, as if sedated or exhausted. They were one of the host of many that invaded these lands. So many. All drunk on the certainty that what they were doing was condoned by a divine will. They killed for it. Killed, Sabrina. We are the only creatures that kill their own on such a scale. Why? A wave crashed between the piles of stone, its foam spreading out around their legs. His eyes followed the swirl of water as if the answer was hidden there. Faith, religiosity, godliness. These things have caused more suffering, pain, and death than all the plagues combined. He turned his gaze to the horizon where clouds rose up in ridges even higher than the green hills of Fortinbras. From this distance, the metal fences and spires of lights and security sensors were invisible. Hills 36 and 34 were gentle slopes, wrapped in blue. When they brought about the weapons that would lead to their ultimate destruction, the scientists wrote that they had harnessed the fire of stars, the hand of the Lord, the power of God. They had seen his face, they said. They were unlocking his mysteries, for in unlocking the power of destruction, they felt they had solved the mystery of creation. They thought they were gods themselves. Now this is what is left. He rested his right hand on the pile of stones, the crumbling brick covered in wild grasses, with barnacles and clams where the water swirled at their base. These ruins were but a prelude to the annihilation that was to come. They couldn't see it, the warnings,
the cycles of ignorance and violence. And so it led to this.
He waved his hand towards the point where the sky met the sea.
A planet burned to cinder.
From someplace deep in him, resurrecting his audiocom voice, Dag added,
Religion is the disease, and you, like me, Sabrina, you have sworn an oath to eradicate it at all costs.
He turned to her, and her breath caught. Tears were streaming down his face.
I'm sorry, Sabrina. I'm sorry that you now know the pain of that oath.
She swallowed hard. This was not the confrontation she had expected. Confusion melted into a strange urge to reconcile with him, even console him. The law is the point at which savagery ended, because civilization stood in its path, she said, afraid she would not even get the words out. You taught me that.
Do not regurgitate at me, Sabrina. She was your friend.
I had my duty.
I am glad to hear that, he said. But I know you love her. And I do too. I love her as I love you.
They were silent a long time, lost in the movement of water and wind. Thank you, Uncle.
But I hate them, he said, suddenly bitter. I hate them for their righteousness, their arrogance, their sanctimony. And I hate them most of all for dragging her and you into this.
They did not seem violent or righteous, she said. Not all of them. When I came upon them, they were peaceful. I think the word is pious?
That is how it begins, Sabrina. It always leads to the same. Blood spilt. Just as it did yesterday.
I know.
I wanted to protect you. I did not want you involved like this. I never wanted you to have to make such a choice.
Did you know, Dag? About Lindsey?
I knew she was at risk. There were warning signs, the creative, flighty nature, the charismatic personality. And of course, there were the visions.
But you continued to let us remain close.
She was your best friend. I would not deny you that.
Sabrina noted the past tense.
But I was always in touch with her parents, reminding them of the importance of adherence in regards to her medications.
Sabrina recalculated a lifetime of memories. She had never been aware of any contact between Dag and Lindsey's parents. It was no small thing to have the head minister call. Yet, all these years, Lindsey's parents had never made mention of it, likely in an effort to provide a bubble, or normalcy around their daughter and her orphaned friend. She wondered where Lindsey's parents were right now, likely being interrogated in separate cells. Lindsey's brother Sam, too. But the thought of them was pushed away by a more unpleasant one. That she had so many times encouraged Lindsey not to take her medicine so that they could experiment with her visions.
It's my fault,
she blurted.
I've failed her. She failed you.
Sabrina's heart beat a little faster at the attack on her friend.
I can serve her and the city by ensuring that justice is done. On other cases, Dag said, straightening. You will understand now why you must be recused from this one.
Sabrina stammered. But what if I want to speak on her behalf? Dag snapped his head around.
What? You can't be serious.
For leniency in her punishment. Who better to speak up for her than the cadet who arrested her?
Sabrina,
Dag said, his voice softened.
I want to see the right thing happen for Lindsey as much as you do.
She needs help.
Indeed she does. You can stand by her as a friend, but not as a member of the officer corps.
Sabrina felt her face flush. She could hear the pulse beating in her ears.
You've already disobeyed me once, Sabrina. But nothing I could do could be worse than the punishment you are experiencing now. Don't squander the goodwill you have earned. You don't know it yet, but you are a hero. The Commissioner has already contacted me to inform me that you will be receiving a prime commendation. No cadet has ever received such a distinction. It was not even my suggestion. It came up through the ranks. Stand by your friend. But as a friend, you have obligations to her, but also to your profession.
She noted the strangeness of his defending her choice to be a cadet for once. A part of her could see the reason in his argument, but another part of her simply hated being told what to do as if she were a child. The wave of emotions she had been restraining the whole morning crested. What about this decision? Are you making this one as my uncle or head minister? And don't tell me it shouldn't matter, because it does. It does to me. Her head spun with misdirected rage. She had lost, and knew it by the look of pity on his face. She wanted to leave right then, but he answered softly, his eyes imploring.
I'm asking you, as the only father you have ever known.
The words, "How dare you," hung, held back by her own flexing jaw. After a deep breath, she turned. Fine, she spat. I needed some time off anyway. Sabrina anticipated the stares when she reached the station, but not the nods, the handshakes, and claps on the back. The congratulations were restrained. Her fellow officers and cadets were sensitive to the fact that she had brought in her best friend, but she had also broken up one of the largest underground occultist rings in history. The flood of discrimination that had borne down on her so long had reversed. It was so disorienting that she did not know how to react. The only officers who seemed unchanged in their distaste for her were Pitt and Boyle. While the others rose to greet her as she passed them in the vehicle bay, Pitt and Boyle remained seated on the runner of a cruiser. Boyle occupied himself with a fleck of dirt on his visor, while Pitt leaned forward to spit at the ground between her feet. To Sabrina, their normalcy was somehow comforting. The 2 guards outside the doors of the detention wing saluted her. She returned them tentatively, willing herself to believe they were genuine. Xandes jumped up from the seat when she saw her. Cadet Sabria! I've never seen our cells fill up so quickly. If you keep this up, we'll have to build another wing. Sabrina had no response and moved quickly to her business. I'm here to see Lindsey Medina. Of course. Xandes nodded, picking up a sedation stick and pressing an intercom button in one efficient motion. Bring prisoner 7919 to interrogation room 2, please. When a voice answered in the affirmative, Xandes straightened so quickly that her white ponytail snapped in the air behind her head. Please follow me, cadet. As they made their way down the hall, Xandes offered the sedation stick. No thanks, Sabrina said. Xandes made a little humph sound, accompanied by a tick of her head. Well, the guard will have one if she acts up. She won't. The room was a bare rectangular box, the empty walls interrupted only by the mirrored window, banks of white glow strips on the ceiling, and a surveillance camera high in the corner. A red light switched on beneath the camera's eye, indicating that someone, likely many people, were now watching as Sabrina settled into one of the chairs. As she sat down, she could not decide if her hands went in her lap or on top of the table. She moved them back and forth, uncertain. The door opened before she was ready. It was the guard she saw first, a blocky man with a bald head, giving her a chance to let out her breath. Lindsey entered after him. She was in a white gown, the same as Jacob had worn. Her hands were chained to a waist belt that was linked to ankle braces. The metal jingled as she moved, a sad parody of her bells. Her skin seemed green under the artificial light. Her hair bows were still intact, a scream of color that seemed incongruous in this joyless place. Likely, they had not had the time to remove them with the number of prisoners to process. Something about them reminded Sabrina of the way Jacob's tattoos had stood out so strangely when smothered by the white of the standard-issue prisoner gown. Lindsey stared down at the table, avoiding Sabrina's eyes. "Are you injured?" Sabrina asked, noticing the plasters on Lindsey's arm. "Nothing serious. They patched me up." "I'm glad." A long silence passed, in which Sabrina was acutely aware of the guard and the insistent red light under the camera. "Have they told you what happens next?" Lindsey swallowed. "I've been interrogated. They will process all of us, like they process scrits." "Rehabilitation?" "Yes." "Do you know what they do?" "No, it's not part of my job." Lindsey nodded and fell silent. Sabrina stared at the long, empty table again. Would it always be like this between them now? Anything she wanted to say, she stopped herself short. There were simply too many people, too many officers, and she was a hero now. What could she say that would not ruin that? "Lindsey, I'm just struggling with why," she said. "I told you in the locker." "But I don't understand." The chain clamored against the edge of the table, and Lindsey slapped both palms down. Sabrina jumped. Lindsey's eyes were filling with tears. "You want to know why? Take a look at the picture of us with my family. You can see why in that." A tear dropped into Sabrina's lap. "We were so happy then." "Look again," Lindsey said. "You'll understand." A fresh patrol suit was waiting in Sabrina's locker, as well as a new blaster. She put them in a carrying case that she dumped into the trunk of her CRP. Normally, she would have kept them in the front seat, but she could not bear the new reminders of her duty now. She rolled through the streets in silence, the stereo off, painfully aware that all the music stored in her roll pod had been selected by Lindsey. She stopped at the intersection of Sterner and Comte streets, hating all the people crossing before her, walking down the sidewalks or passing in their own vehicles. No one escaped her hate. Not the market sellers, nor the bread deliverers, nor the cruiser officers, the teenage boys playing pitchball or the girls braiding one another's hair on a doorstep. They were all still living their lives, while hers had come apart. She rolled through a few twisting old streets before she reached her apartment. It was still early in the afternoon, and the garage was empty. A cold wind blowing in from the sea struck her as she walked between support columns. As she pulled her uniform jacket close, she noticed a swirl of desert sand dancing across the garage floor. It reached the wall, and the wind animating it died, leaving it to fall, just dust on the floor. A cold box in her kitchen was stocked with juices, fruits, and vegetables. Fresh bread and olive oil had been left on the counter. She thought of Sean and smiled. When she went to the washroom to relieve herself, the smell of fresh paint drew her attention to the repaired door frame. This was more than what Sean could have accomplished on his own. She realized the entire station was rallying to support her. She wiped her eyes, glad to finally be alone. Except that she wasn't. Lindsey and her family stared back at her from across the freshly made bed. She sat down on the mattress, the picture in her hands, her eyes moving over the people in the photo, then onto the caterpillars inching their way along the margins. She touched Lindsey, Sam, their parents. None of them had responded to the text message she had sent, informing them that she had seen Lindsey, and that she would be rehabilitated in a few days. No reply at all. But what was there to say to the friend who had betrayed and been betrayed? Everyone looked happy in the picture. No hint of anything sinister. The figures in the background revealed nothing to her, neither did the clouds or the waves, the details of which she had already seen 1,000 times. Although she tried, she could detect no coded message in the swirls of color on the segments of the caterpillars. She even rubbed each one with her thumb, waiting for some sign to appear in a smudge of paint. Then she smashed it. She struck the bedside table repeatedly. The segmented bodies flew, their heads rolled. The frame itself left dents in the table, but she continued to pound it, the glass splintering and breaking, then the frame itself, until the backing snapped, and the last intact piece disintegrated in her hand. The picture fluttered out briefly before landing on the floor, where the blue of the sky stood out in contrast to the white carpet. It was exposed like a precious artifact dropped from its case. Sabrina picked it up, her hand trembling, and turned it over. Lindsey's writing flowed across the back side in looping pink letters. A single line. A single message. Sabrina. Find out what happens to the Skrits. Chapter 12. Deadlands. Sabrina intercepted the delivery boy outside the processing room. He was lanky, almost to the point of gauntness, the sleeves of his jacket stopping well above his wrist. A few stray whiskers that had escaped his razor stood out prominently on his neck. Red bumps marred the skin he had successfully shaved. He smelled of self-consciousness, scents of acne lotion, cologne, and hair cream surrounding him like an aura. "Excuse me. It is Daniel, right?" Sabrina said, shooting a glance over his shoulder to the double doors leading to the processing wing. "Can I speak to you a moment?" "Sure," he said, rolling his chewing gum from one side of his mouth to the other. He paused to examine her. "That suit looks different from all the others." "Newest version," Sabrina said. When she had put on her patrol suit that morning, she realized it was equipped with the latest enhancements. Improvements Moshi, of course, had shown her months before. The newest gear usually went to officers first, not cadets. Clearly, the station bosses had been searching for some way to show their appreciation for her actions in the factory. She guided Daniel with a light touch of her hand around the corner so that they had a certain level of privacy. "I'm Cadet Sabria." His eyes grew wide and mouth open so she could see his chewing gum drop from the roof of his mouth to his tongue. "You're the cadet who brought in all those occultists." "That was me." "Hey, Zoo, that was some serious stuff." "Daniel, I'm not here to talk about station business. I'm not supposed to talk about that stuff anyway." "Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry." She sighed. "Listen, my friend Zandy's likes you." "Zandy's fail?" He blew out a long sigh between his lips. "Officer, Zandy's fail? The ice sculpture on the other side of those doors?" "It's hard for her to show it. It's not easy being a female officer." "She likes me?" "I think you have the wrong guy," he said, his thumb in his chest. "You are the delivery boy. Man, that makes all the deliveries to the detention wing, right?" "Yeah, but she never talks to me much. Sometimes I say hello. She just sort of grunts." "She's got a terrible boss. It puts her in a bad mood. Listen, she just needs to know you are interested. Just show some persistence. I'll cover for you. I'll get you some time with her today." "Why are you doing this?" "'Cause she is my friend, and I'm tired of listening to her complain that she's not getting laid." Daniel stopped chewing. He readjusted the package under his arm and lifted the bill of his cap. "Well, maybe I can ask her out." "You definitely can. Just remember, persistence," Sabrina said, slapping his shoulders and pushing him at the doors. He moved towards them with a deep swagger to his step and kicked them apart with his foot. He called out an enthusiastic "good morning" to Zandy's. Sabrina saw the confused expression on the female officer's face before the doors swung closed. She pressed her forehead against the wall. The patrol suit, using a helpful female voice in her earpiece, informed her that her pulse and heart rates were elevated. It suggested ways to lower her blood pressure when not on duty: exercise, reducing her sodium intake, breathing, and stretching exercises. She cut the message off and tried to still her shaking hands. She decided the show of nerves might actually help her in the fraud she was about to perpetrate. When enough time had passed, she entered the doors herself. Daniel's body was leaning at an angle against Zandy's desk, his weight balanced on his elbow. His hips were cocked to the side, and his other hand hooked on his belt. "Cadet Sabria!" Zandy said, jumping to her feet and looking past Daniel. "How can I help you?" "I need to see Derp. I can't wait in line," she said, walking around the desk. "I'll take this for you." She swept Daniel's delivery tablet from the counter and headed for Derp's closed office door. She did not knock, but instead slapped it open, then slammed it after her. Derp's office was illuminated by the 24 screens on his desk, tilted towards him. They bathed him in a blue glow that gave his skin a sickly pallor. His hand cupped a greasy headset to his ear, and he listened to the different interrogation displayed on each screen. His rheumy eyes, the flesh beneath them sagging, shifted towards Sabrina without a hint of surprise.
"Well, Princess Sabrina, you're keeping us busy down here,"
he said. She made a long, conspicuous scan of the room, noting the dirty table, the cold cube humming in the corner, and his jacket hanging on the clothes tree beside the door. The desk was covered with empty food containers. The reclamation bin in the corner was already overflowing with bottles, wrappers, and empty plates. She suspected it was the leftovers of a pitchball watching party, but she was most interested in the jacket. "You sure know how to make a place feel like home," she said.
"They send you to clean it?"
She took a deep breath, clenching and unclenching her jaw while waving the signature tablet. "I'm here for the delivery boy. Apparently he thinks you're a sack of filth and would rather try to score a date with Xandes than speak to you." Laughter erupted from him and he leaned back in his chair.
"It would be good to get her married off. Loosen her up."
His laugh subsided and he patted his knee.
"You got yourself a man, cadet? Or have you been too busy playing scissor sister with your friend down the hall?"
Her head felt light with a sudden rush of blood. "The delivery boy was wrong. You are not a sack of filth. You're a pile of fetid excrement." She sent the tablet spinning at his face. He snatched it out of the air, his hand seizing it like a clamp.
"Tell the delivery boy good luck,"
he said, removing a stylus from the side of the tablet and scrawling his signature across the screen. It seemed strange to her that a creature like Derp knew how to write. "I'll tell him to hurry up. His lorry is blocking my cruiser."
"As long as it's not blocking my sickness seater. I got a load of dead heads to ship to Dr. Horowitz."
He held out the tablet. She crossed the room and reached for it, maintaining as great a distance from him as she could. Once she had the tablet in hand, he let his hands fall to his thighs. His lips smacked as if he was trying to suck a piece of food from his teeth. When she stepped back, the corners of his mouth ticked downward.
"New suit,"
he said.
"Fits you well."
Sabrina felt the need to fill the silence that followed as he stared at her. "This office is a disgrace."
"It looks better with the lights off. Like a lot of things."
She cleared her throat, glancing at the bank of screens. To her relief, she did not see Lindsey in any of the frames. She made a short path to the door.
"Maybe I should be more careful about what I say,"
Derp said.
"After all, you did bring in your best friend."
It was the opening she had been waiting for. She turned on him, swinging out her arm, grabbing the clothes tree, and slamming it to the floor. The oversized jacket ballooning, then deflating on the floor. The entire gesture elicited a whoop from Derp.
"You listen to me, you pus sucker." "No, you listen to me,"
Derp said through his howls of laughter.
"You are going to have to clean that up now."
His guffaws mutated into high-pitched titters, broken by wheezes. His cheeks shook, and the skin on his neck turned red. He pounded his thigh with his fist. Sabrina swept up the jacket tree in one exasperated motion and went to the door.
"Not that anyone would notice in this sty,"
she grumbled. He laughed again, cheerfully, his voice echoing into the hallway.
"You're all right, cadet. You can come back here any time."
He spoke as if they were best friends. In a strange way, she wondered if they now were, the insult being Derp's language of camaraderie. Daniel was still at the desk, now turned so that both elbows balanced on the counter. He was working on making arrangements in 3 weeks' time. "I'm not available that evening," Xandes was saying. "That is my continuing education night." "I thought you said you had continuing education on second days," Daniel said. He had removed his hat and was scratching his head. Sabrina passed them and flung the tablet at Daniel. It clattered across the counter and he lost his hat diving for it. "Cadet Sabria, are you all right?" Xandes said, running from behind the desk to follow in Sabrina's wake.
"Derp is a pig."
Xandes looked at Sabrina, her eyes knowing and sympathetic at the same time. "Is there anything else I can do for you? Would you like to visit your friend this morning?"
"She's not my friend,"
Sabrina said, slapping open the double doors in a final grandiose display of fury, calculating her outrage carefully. She swept down the hall, her boots echoing loudly as she walked in what she hoped was a pace that conveyed disgust, exasperation, and hostility. 2 fellow cadets came around the corner and swerved to avoid her. An officer offered an enthusiastic salute, which she returned with indifference. The spectacle worked. By the time she neared the vehicle bay, she felt protected by a shell of anger. She did her best to maintain the air, even as her heart fluttered in her chest and her palms sweated as she clutched the access pass she had stolen from Derp's jacket. She checked out a power cycle and 2 extra batteries, loading them into the stowage cases on either side of the rear tire. She was not officially on duty, but in her patrol suit, with her newfound reputation, no one questioned her. Administrative officers responded to her request with swift efficiency. Haddon Blanchard, the head mechanic, provided her with the newest cycle. He was a quiet man with a reputation for being able to fix anything. He also boxed at the station gym, and was one of the few people who would cheer for Sabrina when she was fighting an opponent. She suspected he would have ordered her the newest cycle anyway, but the speed with which his maintenance crew fetched the cycle, wiped it down, then rushed to open the rolling gate was novel. Haddon watched his men a moment, a half smile at the corner of his lips, while he shook his head.
"How does it feel to be a hero?"
he asked. "Honestly?" He nodded. "I hate it." Haddon smiled, then began walking back to his office.
"You have a safe ride, Cadet."
Outside on Avalos Street, she was relieved to be away from the station and able to act like just another cadet. As she sat her cycle on its kickstand across from the detention wing of the station, passing residents treated her with the same wary indifference they would any member of the security ministry. She waited as inconspicuously as possible, her visor down and hair tucked beneath her helmet, making herself as unrecognizable as possible. When a cruiser rolled by, she did her best to appear engaged with a palm tablet, tipping her face up and nodding to her passing peers only at the last minute. In truth, the tablet was blank. All she saw before her eyes were the pink scrawling words. Sabrina, find out what happens to the Scrits. Had that message always been there? Had Lindsey known this would happen? She tried to piece things together, but the gaps were too large. All that was left to do was to follow her friend's imperative. Then maybe she would understand. An admin officer from the detention wing walked out into the flow of CRPs and raised his hands to stop the traffic. A large door rolled open behind him, and the mirrored windscreen of the prisoner transport rocked into the sunlight. Distorted reflections of the buildings and traffic scrolled across the glass. The long, white, double-decker vehicle barely cleared the bay doors. Its chassis sat high up from the road's surface, lifted by all-terrain tires. Rows of tinted windows ran its length, allowing for some light in the back for the prisoners. But the windows were set too high for occupants chained to the benches to see through. Rolling along the road without being able to see out the windows made many of the passengers motion sick, earning the transports their nickname, sickness seaters. Unlikely cadets were often given the task of hosing out the insides after the transport had made a run, and no amount of cleanser and water could ever eliminate the smell of vomit. Sabrina knew Dag would have objected to such an uncomfortable ride for prisoners, but even she knew a sick prisoner was a much more cooperative one. A high-pitched squeal echoed off the building as the transport braked at the corner, CRPs moving past its bulk like small pups. The admin officer was disappearing down the ramp, the bay door closing behind him. The gears of the transport clanged as it began to roll forward again to turn the corner. Sabrina charged her cycle, pulled out into traffic, and followed. The carrier headed out along the coastal road, tracing a path around the foot of Hill 36. The road turned north, the sea opening up on Sabrina's right, wide and blue. She passed a few roll pod repair shops and fishing hamlets before the distances between residential buildings grew. Man-made structures eventually gave way to wild fennel and the occasional tamarisk tree, but even these were sparse. For the most part, the land was empty sea, and empty desert rolling past. The traffic was light at this time of mid-morning. It was easy to follow the big white transport in such a landscape. The challenge was to avoid attracting the driver's attention. She held back behind a fruit lorry for a while, a dishcloth displaying the colors of the driver's favorite pitchball team snapping from the rear gate. The lorry provided her cover until a farmer, hauling a tractor, pulled onto the road ahead, slowing them. The transport shrank to a small white rectangle on the horizon. Sabrina kicked the cycle into overdrive, the wind rising around her, the machine's vibration settling into a gentle hum as she passed both vehicles and approached a speed closer to what the cycle's makers had intended. The sun was near its zenith, and the transport slowed and turned off the main highway, heading west. Hills closed on either side and quickly concealed the vehicle, but the dust cloud left in its wake betrayed its path. Sabrina changed the terrain settings on the suspension and rode onto the dirt road. After a few minutes, the dirt gave way to jagged, pockmarked slabs, all that was left of an older road, likely built before the transition. They were in the Deadlands. Sabrina had heard of them, but had never visited. These were areas of arid hardpan bordering the irradiated waste that surrounded the former capital city. The wastes were nothing but radioactive ruins, fields of rubble and smoky glass where the heat of explosions in the capital had transformed the desert sands. The Deadlands ringed the waste, a buffer with pockets of radiation still high enough to kill. Sabrina cycled through menus on her visor and placed a radiation monitor in the corner of her vision. The levels were elevated, but she was safe for now. She followed the transport well into the afternoon. The air was hot and stifling in the hills. The planet's temperatures had risen after the cataclysm, and here, among the hills, there was no sea breeze to abate the sun's power. She passed old orchards on either side, the dead stumps filling the fields like tombstones in a graveyard. Trees and shrubs that had held together hillsides had shriveled in the changed climate, their roots withering so much so that even the mountain faces decayed, their faces sliding off in avalanches, leaving piles of scree along the road. The carrier braked before making another turn. Farther up the next valley, she spotted an abandoned settlement on a hilltop, the houses still distinguishable among overgrown trees, the only green she had seen in hours. She charged the engine and climbed the road towards the houses. From the hilltop, she could see the transport's destination, another cluster of buildings at the terminus of the road. The compound was surrounded by glittering razor wire fences. Green fields and orchards carpeted the land within, a stark contrast to the surrounding sea of brown. 3 bulbous water towers looming over the compound were surpassed in height only by the comm tower, one of the largest Sabrina had ever seen. Sabrina kept an eye on the transport and its approach to the compound as she climbed the hill towards the abandoned settlement. The hilltop settlement was sealed by a crooked gate and a rusting fence. Sabrina dismounted in front of the gate and cut through using a set of pliers from the cycle's toolkit. She rolled the cycle forward and hid it in a narrow alley between 2 stucco white houses. She ran just below the ridgeline, careful not to silhouette herself against the sky, and found a vantage point to zoom in on the compound with her visor. 2 armed guards exited the gatehouse as the transport approached. One guard conversed with the driver, while another walked the length of the vehicle. Once the inspection was complete, they waved the driver through. The transport pulled up to a building that was fenced, even within the compound. Detention guards, their white padded uniforms and sedation sticks recognizable to Sabrina even at a distance, opened the doors and let the prisoners out. The prisoners from the top row of the carrier emerged in an orderly single file, dazed, stumbling, and clinging to one another. The guards led them with little fanfare through a door on the side of the building. The extraction of the prisoners from the lower deck was completely different. Sabrina noticed that although parked, the carrier was rocking. Additional detention guards came running into the lot and surrounded it, positioning themselves around the back door, their sedation sticks lowered. 3 significantly larger guards held modified sticks with collars at the ends. After a long pause, the guards threw open the doors and the prisoners came flooding out in a panic. A few guards herded them into a far end of the lot. They came obediently, running with their chains in hand. Sabrina zoomed in further, so close she could see the fear in their eyes. Those who had their wits about them, who appeared to be ordinary occultists, guided the scrits who tripped and scrambled about, confused and terrified, their memories impaired. Meanwhile, the larger guards with the modified sedation sticks rushed the carrier. More rocking. One guard tumbled out of the back door, a red gash across his forehead. Another jumped in to take his place. Eventually, the rocking of the vehicle subsided. The guards appeared at the back door with what appeared to be a single prisoner. A woman. Despite being in a collar, she was fighting, but her resistance went far beyond that of an ordinary prisoner. She moved like a wild animal, bucking, swiping, and kicking, her gray hair down over her face as she threw her captors back and forth with unbelievable strength. Her hands were covered in blood, and when one of the guards pulled back on her mane of hair revealing her face, her mouth was mottled in bright red gore. The other prisoners were shrinking back in their corner of the lot, as the wild woman was led through a different door. 4 men had to lean on the 2 sedation sticks locked to her collar to force her through. An overwhelming sense of dread rose up within Sabrina. Her visor felt as if it would slip off her face from her perspiration. She reached for her canteen and swallowed hard, afraid that she was becoming dehydrated. Water spilled from the canteen as she tried to replace the cap, her entire body trembling. She reminded herself it had been many hours since she had eaten, and that she should have something soon. Once the wild woman was gone, other guards led the prisoners into the building. The lot was empty until 2 more staff members arrived. They stepped into the back of the vehicle and emerged, carrying the body of a prisoner in a monomer sheet. Even at this distance, the stains of blood on the body were visible through the sheet. The hands hung out at the end of the sheet, the chains fastened pointlessly to the wrists. The driver finally returned, moved the carrier to another lot, and carried a hose into the back to clean. When he was done, he shut the back doors and also disappeared inside the building, leaving Sabrina with nothing to watch but the empty lot, shimmering in the heat. She absently chewed some biscuits she had packed in the pocket of her suit, although she did not taste them. All her thoughts were focused on the image of the woman's face as she howled with animal-like rage. After eating something, Sabrina was able to focus enough to watch for another 2 hours. The perimeter guards' intervals were of particular interest to her. They made a circuit every 30 minutes, and when the sun had shifted and afternoon shadows appeared, Sabrina was able to get an infrared image on the watchtowers. She was pleased to see no heat signature whatsoever. They were not manned. Instead, the passing guards used them only to gain a vantage point over the surrounding landscape. In the evening, there was a great deal of movement between the main buildings of the central compound and the barracks in the rear. A squat building set in the far southwest corner appeared to be a canteen and the destination for a number of off-duty staff. It was likely the only place of recreation. The staff ate at tables under shady trellises, then smoke rose from a chimney in the back. The perimeter guards slowed and greeted their acquaintances when they passed. Sabrina knew it was where she would enter the compound.